This will be part 2 of chapter 2. As I finished chapter 1, we was in Fort Myers, working for Mr. Tillis in the furniture business. And that was about as hard a job as I ever had. And we lived on about as little money as a family of 4 could live on. No, there's 5 then. And in December of 38, Ed was born. That made 4. I continued to work on that job through 39, and I had acquired a friend that was with Gulf Life Insurance Company. And he said he thought he could get me on as an agent with Gulf Life. And he was making around $100 a week, so that was considerable improvement. About the middle of 1940, I got the job. I left Mr. Tillis and the furniture business and went with Gulf Life. And they gave me a debit largely in the same area that I had worked the furniture business in, which caused a lot of mileage. Had quite a bit of running to do to work that debit. Well, it did work out pretty good. That was the middle of 1940, and I was earning around maybe an average of $75 a week, paying my car expenses out of that. So that was a little better than what we had been doing. In December of, that was in 40, and I went on through the year of December of 41, that the war broke out. But before that time, I had met some friends up there on my route at LaBelle and Fort Deneau that offered to sell me the home, 40 acres of land, about 20 acres of old thrown-away orange grove, hadn't been worked for several years, on a credit. Well, I seen that as an opportunity to live closer to my work and possibility that I might make something out of it. So I took them up on it. 12th day of July, 1941, we moved in. By that time, they had cut off most of the gasoline. You was not eligible to get gas for that type of work. Neither could you buy tires. So I had to scoop around the best I could and get a little gas, and put a great deal of that debit on the mailing list. And that practically killed it. Income got real poor all through 1941. Managed to hang in, but by the end of 1941, there was no way to stay in the insurance business when you couldn't have a car to use. So I left the Gulf Life, and I had a friend that was been with Seaboard Railroad, and he told me that that I could get a job with the railroad. Well, at that time, that was one of the best paying jobs that you could get. Plus, it would exempt you from the war. If you was a railroad man, you wouldn't get drafted. Well, that was pretty important also. So about the 1st of 1942, I went to Tampa, and I worked. At that time, you had to ride the road 2 weeks, learning the road and how the working part of the railroad. And you did that for free. They didn't pay you anything. So, when I got through with the work, I taken the trainman's examination and passed. Well, they would have put me on the extra board, but they didn't have a watch and I didn't have one, so you couldn't go on the railroad without a watch. I came back home to Fort Deneau at that time and found out that the county agent had a job opening, and he had give some thought to offering it to me. So I seen him before he gave it to anybody else. And that was loan representative of the Regional Agricultural Credit Corporation, Washington, D.C., for the purpose of loaning farmers money to increase their production in crops that was important to the war effort. So instead of going back to the railroad, I taken that job and stayed at home. It didn't pay very much money, but it was not much expense to it. I had an office in the courthouse, and so I went to work at that. That was controlled by the loan agent and the Henry County War Board. The War Board was appointed by the Federal Land Bank in Columbia, South Carolina, as community control of community affairs during the war to work out the best methods for handling all the war problems. So I went to working on the farms, loaning a little money to this farmer and that farmer and the other farmer, and being eligible for a loan. And I was on the farm and on the grove. I decided I'd get one for myself, and I did. $2,500. A lot of money in them days. I planted about 20 acres of sweet potatoes, and it was one of them wet summers, and spring and summer, and flooded my potato field. Just kept it so that I never did make any potatoes. Just ruined. All of that effort, work, and money was thrown away. In the meantime, I had got a chance to buy about 100 head of hogs. And I thought, well, I'll plant about 10 acres of chufers. That's something similar to peanuts for hog feed. And I'd fatten them hogs and sell them and help the war effort and also maybe make a little money. About the time that the hogs had eat up the feed that I had in the field, about 10 acres, there was a war agricultural ruling that came out that no farmer could sell or slaughter any more hogs that year than he did the year before. So the year before I didn't have any hogs. So that put me with the hogs, and the feed was out, and couldn't sell them and couldn't butcher them. So my goodness, that was the time. The hogs, a lot of them nearly starved to death. Finally got a man from some hog slop farm at Palm Beach. Come in there and loaded them up and hauled them off and got almost nothing for them. So there was the two projects under that loan that flopped. Fortunately, the Congress had, in setting up that agency, had put a rule in there that if a farmer used that money to try to increase his production in the war effort and failed to make it, that the Congress would automatically issue a satisfaction to that lien. So after about a year and a half, I reckon I got a satisfaction to that lien, and that cleared that up. Well, that put me there in that community. That job didn't last quite all of that year before they canceled that operation. Then I was out of work and no money. U.S. Sugar Company gave me a job, but it was not very much of a job. I think it paid $135 a month, and I had to drive about 60 miles a day going and coming to get to it. So with about that, we will end the second part of chapter 2 on the program. This will start part 1 of chapter 3. And I want to go back to 1942, since that was the year that I was elected county commissioner in Henry County. Since I had worked that territory in the furniture business and in the insurance business, I knew a great many of the people in that district. And as the politics began to warm up that year, some of my friends began to ask me to run for county commissioner because they didn't like the man they had. So I had never ventured in anything like that, but anyway, I did. Qualified, made my announcements, had my cards printed up, got my name in the paper, started politicking along with my insurance work. And I had about 3, I'm not sure whether it was 3 or 4 opponents in that race. So it was a pretty interesting race. Several people trying to get the job. In the May primary, I eliminated every opponent I had by a sizable majority. So, in a sense, that was equivalent to being elected. However, it takes the November election to finalize it, and nobody ran against me in November. So I was elected. Taking office in January of 1943. Well, that did me a lot of good towards being able to get some finances and to start trying to build up that grove and to get it pruned, and just a lot of things that had to be done. And I had to do it on spare time when I wasn't working, weekends and afternoons. So it strengthened me considerably in the community and made it possible for me to be able to get some bank credit that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. So along the first of that year, 43, your mother wanted to go in the restaurant business, thought she could make a little money and help out, and though she had no experience, and neither did I, but anyway, we rented a building. They had been a restaurant there. So we kind of remodeled it and got started off in the restaurant business. It was a disappointment from day one to the last day. In 7 weeks, I lost about $700. And back in them days, that was a terrible backset, hard to overcome. But anyway, I went to see the man I leased the building from and asked him if he would release us, since we had closed it up from the contract that we rented it on for a year. He said no, he would expect his rent every month unless we could sublease it to somebody. So I don't remember, maybe it was 2 or 3 months I had to pay the rent before somebody else wanted the building, and that got me off of the hook. Sometime the early part of 1943, I was appointed member of the Henry County War Board. And that appointment come from the Federal Land Bank, Columbia, South Carolina. How it come about, I don't know. I just got the notice of the appointment in the mail. Well, there was several of my friends that was on the board, and that made me a member. So that put me in the very center of all of the rationing activities of the war. Who could buy gasoline, or who could buy tires, or who could buy sugar, or what have you. So that taken a lot of time. We had a lot of meetings, and we had a lot of complaints and different things to solve as best we could. Later on that year, I was appointed to the Selective Service Board. All told, I was nearly about completely busy with wartime activities. And we had a lot of people in that country that was working for the U.S. Sugar Company that was exempt from the draft because of their agricultural connections. Because anyway, it required a lot of work to get them classified and to get them exempt. I made several trips to Tallahassee to the Adjutant General office pertaining to the work of the draft board and of getting the proper classification for men that was essential to the operation of the U.S. Sugar Company. And it happened that the Adjutant General of the state of Florida at that time's name was Vivian Collins. And when I grew up about maybe 18 or 20, he was running the Farm and Merchants Bank in Plant City. And the first money I ever borrowed, I borrowed from Vivian Collins in the Farm and Merchants Bank in Plant City. So probably he didn't remember me, but I remembered him well, and in our visits we talked about his experience there in Plant City as a banker, and so on. The U.S. Sugar Company had an attorney by the name of Fred Sykes, and he accompanied me up there as a legal representative of the U.S. Sugar Company on several occasions. And in the work of being a county commissioner, we had, it was necessary to make trips to Tallahassee pertaining to county affairs. So it was a rather busy time. I went ahead with what time I could spare in pruning the grove, and plowing, and trying to get it into production, which was about a 3 or 4 year task before you could get the grove to where it would make enough fruit to pay its way. But anyway, I made some progress with that. Well, that would move us along pretty well. 44 was pretty much the same thing as the year 43 was. Very busy indeed, and as I had said previously, I worked for the sugar company some in that period of time. So there wasn't a great deal of change in 43 and 44 and 45. I might mention that in the latter part of 42, our last baby boy was born, William Hardy, named after my daddy. And in the early part of 43, we lost that baby. And as time went on, in 1945, a tornado, one Saturday night, hit our place. There wasn't anybody at home. I'd gone up to Larry's place at Welcome. Me and I think maybe one of the boys, and we were spending the night up there and going back on Sunday. And Ruby and the other kids had gone downtown, and the kids was in the show. And she was in the drugstore with some other friends, and somebody came in and said, did you know your house is laying across the road down there? Well, of course, she couldn't conceive of that, but anyway, they went down and there it was. It was a good 5 or 6 room house with 2 porches. And it blowed the house about 10 feet north and about 6 or 8 feet west and set it flat on the ground. On Sunday morning, I got the message to come home at once. So I went and got down there in the afternoon, and there they had highway patrolmen out there on the highway directing the traffic. People had come from far and near. So what another calamity that was. Windows, a lot of them was broke out, screens gone, fireplace gone. But anyway, we stayed there. And to keep the mosquitoes off of us of the night, we run a little electric fan. Buzz the mosquitoes out pretty well. Well, that afternoon, some 10 or 12 men agreed to meet me back there on Monday morning to go to work on redoing that house. And I guess they must have hoped me, 8 or 10 days, a week or longer than a week, of getting the house back in shape. And about the time we got through with that, or most of them was knocking off, leaving the other details that was left for me, one of my friends drove up there to the house one evening and called me out to his car. And I got in and sat down with him, and he counted me out $500. That he had headed a little drive around among the community and the friends to get me a little help. Well, my goodness alive, that was the greatest thing. I had that much cash money give to me. Made me feel like that every time I met anybody in the community or in town or on the street, I ought to bow to them for the wonderful response that they had given to me during that calamity. I had some insurance, but when I went down to report it to the agent said, I don't think you have anything but fire and lightning. I don't think you have windstorm insurance. So that was that. Had no insurance at all. So that will about bring me up to the close of part 1 of chapter 3.